The Vietnam War commenced with the noble intentions of well-meaning individuals, but some 20 years later, it concluded with devastating consequences. For the Vietnamese, it was not merely a struggle centered around communism. It was a battle for independence and the sovereignty of Vietnam. However, a combination of American overconfidence, the tensions of the Cold War, and imperialistic inclinations that the United States had previously opposed collectively cast a dark shadow over the Vietnam conflict. When the war ultimately drew to a close, it left an indelible mark on America's relatively brief but intricate history. By the war's end, the toll was staggering. More than 58,000 American lives were lost, alongside 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers. Over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong guerrillas also perished, and the civilian population bore a heavy burden with over 2 million casualties from both the north and the south side. Additionally, thousands of lives were lost in the neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia. French colonial rule. In 1858, the French began their conquest of Indochina, touting their mission to introduce their culture to Vietnam and launching infrastructure projects like roads and bridges. However, the Vietnamese did not embrace the French any more warmly than prior invaders, such as the Chinese. In 1919, after World War I, American President Woodrow Wilson journeyed to Paris to reshape the post-war world and advocate for the independence of colonized nations. During his stay, a Vietnamese nationalist, later known as Ho Chi Minh, presented President Woodrow Wilson with a petition signed by himself and fellow nationalists urging Vietnam's independence. Though the president's secretary promised to convey the petition, there is no evidence it reached Wilson's attention. By 1940, World War II had plunged the world into chaos, with Germany's conquest of Western Europe, including France, and the Japanese occupation of Vietnam. To resist the Japanese, Ho Chi Minh returned and established the Vietnam Independence League, or Viet Minh. This movement gained momentum, employing guerrilla tactics and hit-and-run strategies which would prove pivotal when the Americans entered the scene. In the spring of 1945, 3 years after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, the United States government sought ways to undermine Japanese forces in Vietnam. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan's surrender seemed imminent. Ho Chi Minh seized the moment, calling on the Vietnamese to rise up before the French could reimpose colonial rule. On September 2, 1945, the day Japan surrendered, hundreds of thousands gathered in Ba Dinh Square, Hanoi, as Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence. The future looked hopeful, but the geopolitical landscape was rapidly changing. President Franklin Roosevelt, an advocate for independence and self-governing states, had passed away, and his successor, Harry Truman, faced a transformed world with the Soviet Union's expanding influence and the onset of the Cold War. Dien Bien Phu. By 1953, with substantial American aid, the French had been embroiled in Vietnam for 7 years, enduring over 100,000 casualties. French platoons faced constant ambushes, blown-up trains, and obstructed roads, all followed by more ambushes. The Viet Minh, supported by the Soviets and Chinese, had evolved into a formidable adversary, demoralizing the French. The French sought negotiations to end the conflict, but before talks commenced, both sides tried to strengthen their military positions. The French established a fortified base in Dien Bien Pha, convinced that any confrontation would result in their victory, even overlooking the jungle-covered hills that loomed over their 11,000 soldiers. A new nation. Following an armistice, Vietnam was divided along the 17th parallel, with a demilitarized zone serving as the buffer. Civilians had 300 days to choose their preferred destination, leading to the migration of 900,000 refugees to the south, seeking a life free from communism, where Ho Chi Minh and the communists implemented land reforms akin to those under Mao, resulting in thousands of deaths and imprisonments. The Viet Cong, along with their leaders, were determined to break the peace, heading southward along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to fight for a united Vietnam. As the United States entered the scene with John F. Kennedy's presidency, Cold War tensions reached new heights. The lessons learned from World War II emphasized the need to halt aggressive dictatorships before they posed a substantial threat to global peace. With communism expanding in Southeast Asia, Kennedy's advisors pressed for a more assertive stance. However, Kennedy refrained from sending ground troops in Vietnam. Nevertheless, as the American military presence in South Vietnam grew, Ho Chi Minh anticipated a northern invasion as inevitable. President Nixon had previously assured South Vietnam that in times of crisis, the U.S. Air Force would come to their aid, as they did during the Easter Offensive. However, Nixon's resignation in August 1974 due to the Watergate scandal altered the situation dramatically. Congress drastically cut funds and assistance to South Vietnam, leading to the departure of 20,000 ARVN troops each month. The United States had supplied weapons but insufficient ammunition, aircraft without pilots or training, and trucks without spare parts. After 3 decades of civil war, Saigon was on the verge of falling. Everything that American soldiers had fought and sacrificed for was on the brink of unraveling. On April 29th, the invasion of Saigon commenced, triggering a frantic evacuation effort. Helicopters shuttled groups of people to aircraft carriers and ships, returning for more until the vessels reached capacity. To prevent further evacuees, some helicopters were pushed into the ocean. South Vietnam surrendered to halt the bloodshed, and many were sent to re-education camps for extended periods. Finally, after 30 years of war, 2 million deaths, millions of refugees, and devastated villages, Vietnam was united under one communist nation with assistance from the Soviet Union. The country adopted a new socialist system, collectivized agriculture, abolished capitalism, nationalized industry, and installed central planners to manage everything under strict communist principles. The consequences were disastrous as the standard of living plummeted, leading to widespread starvation. The war also exposed the manipulation of body counts to inflate kill-death ratios and the disregard for human life in battles dictated by political objectives rather than military necessity. Pride often transformed minor skirmishes into extravagant events, as America's unwavering commitment to victory and the refusal to back down at any cost took precedence. But amid the political turmoil, it's essential not to forget the soldiers on all sides who risked their lives, displayed bravery, and endured the horrors of war. In conclusion, the Vietnam War was not just a military conflict, it was a deeply political and transformative event that left an indelible mark on both America and Vietnam.